Hello everybody, I'm here today to talk about some books I've read over the last month. October was basically half spooky stuff and half Victorian stuff because I decided to participate for the first time in the Victober Readathon, that's Victorian October. I was torn between which one of these I wanted to do, and then I ended up compromising and just doing a little bit of both. The first book I'm going to talk about is a somewhat obscure work of nonfiction published in 1966, Incident at Exeter by John G. Fuller. I heard about this book, I think it was last year, from the weatherman, believe it or not. You don't expect the AccuWeather meteorologist to be someone that you pick up book recommendations from, but there you go. Thanks, Mark Mancuso. In 1965, there was a rash of national and international UFO sightings. Yes, this is a book about UFOs, and journalist John G. Fuller decided to make a concentrated study of one particularly interesting series of reports that came from the area of Exeter, New Hampshire. As any good journalist should, Fuller went into this investigation with an open mind, but also with a healthy dose of skepticism. Yet he found the credibility of the majority of witnesses he interviewed to be far more convincing than he expected, and I was certainly convinced by his report. With a pile of corroborating statements, a series of extremely questionable attempts by military authorities to falsify witnesses' claims, and his own sighting, Fuller was eventually led to certain conclusions and speculations at the end of his book that I found pretty chilling. For the record, I don't believe in aliens. Partly because I don't want aliens to exist. I've seen enough movies and TV shows to know that if they do exist, they're probably hostile, and I don't want that. But I am less of a skeptic than I used to be when it comes to unidentified flying objects, especially since I saw one myself a couple years ago. It was night, and we had some family visiting, and we had eaten pizza, I think it was. Somebody went outside, and then they came back in and said, "Hey, come look outside, look at this thing that's in the sky, I don't know what it is." We went out and we looked at it, and none of us could identify it. It wasn't a plane. We see planes going overhead all the time, and it did not look like a plane at all. It looked like a fireball. I don't think it was a drone. I don't know what it was. And we watched it go out of sight, and it was really weird. With regard to the incident at Exeter in 1965, there was definitely something strange going on, whether it was extraterrestrial or not. There were too many corroborating witnesses, too many stories that checked out for it to have been a massive conspiracy. Whatever it was, it made for a good spooky story on a stormy night. I ended up enjoying it a lot more than I expected to. It may be a little dated, it may be a little dry and a little redundant in parts as Fuller's going around and interviewing people and asking them the same questions again and again to try to shake them up and get different answers. I didn't have a problem with that though, because this was just such a fine example of solid investigative reporting that was also engaging at the same time. Fuller did write a follow-up sequel to this book called The Interrupted Journey, in which he closely examined the account of a married couple who claimed to have had a close personal encounter with aliens following their UFO sighting. I'd like to read it, but on the other hand, alien abductions. I'm fine with alien invasion stuff, but alien abductions, ugh. But I am most definitely going to read more of Fuller's work. I really admired his style. Not that it's particularly fancy or deep, it's just clear, thorough, no-frills reporting on some really interesting topics. So don't be surprised if at some point his name comes up again. After that, I read The Kraken Wakes by John Wyndham. Some of you will remember that last year I really enjoyed reading Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids, and I've reviewed a couple different adaptations of that story. I've been wanting to read something else by him, and I chose this one, published in 1953. The story was different than I expected. The title, The Kraken Wakes, gave me visions of giant tentacled sea monsters trying to take over the world, and it was a little bit different from that. It's not It was more technical, I guess, than just a sea monster trying to swallow England. It was an interesting take with its slow unfolding of the apocalypse. My complaint with a lot of apocalyptic stories is that once the whatever it is that is going to cause the end of the world starts happening, things go down so fast, and then poof, we're already in a post-apocalyptic state. I like that Wyndham's approach here is much more gradual, and with his main characters working for the National Broadcasting Network, he's able to examine how easily the tide of public opinion can be swayed, how people panic one day, and then with the reassurance of government and science that they're doing something about it, no need to panic, they just go back to regular life and forget about this weird, awful, unexplained thing that happened. Forget about it until it happens again, or something even worse happens that nobody can explain, and then the outrage and panic starts up again. It's a cycle that repeats multiple times throughout this book until the crisis becomes unmanageable and everything falls apart. And then you have your post-apocalyptic state. I thought this method of invasion and takeover was really interesting too. It was not at all what I was expecting, but I enjoyed reading it. It was unusual. Sometimes it was hard to picture, and it was not without a few similarities to the Triffids story as well. So John Wyndham is currently 2 for 2 for me, and the next thing I read by him will either be The Midwich Cuckoos or The Chrysalids. Unless I find something else that sounds better. There was a book about spiders, I think it was called Web. That sounded interesting. It was not as highly rated as some others, but that could just be because it hasn't been read as much. It's not as well known as The Midwich Cuckoos and The Day of the Triffids. At this point in the month, I switched over to reading Victorian literature, and for my main selection, I went for Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. I've already seen the 1999 miniseries adaptation a couple times, though not recently, and I haven't reviewed it yet. And I've wanted to read the book for a long time now, especially since North and South was so good. The book, not just the scrumptious 2004 adaptation. Wives and Daughters focuses on a girl named Molly Gibson whose mother died when she was very young. She's enjoyed a close relationship with her father throughout her girlhood and always thought their situation a happy one. So when he decides to get married again, it's unexpected and awkward for poor Molly, especially because the widow that he chooses to marry, though she's a very attractive, pretty lady, is actually vain and silly, and don't get me started on her. Molly tries to behave the way she ought toward her new mother, but it isn't easy. And though she becomes close friends with her new stepsister, Cynthia has certain things that she's hiding. And these things make life pretty difficult for poor Molly. Notice I said poor Molly twice. Yeah, that was a common refrain while I was reading this book. I liked the book. Molly Gibson is one of those heroines who you feel you could be friends with. She's a very real, sympathetic character, and it's impossible not to feel frustrated alongside her as she struggles through these situations where she wants to say something in defense of herself or of those she cares about when they're being spoken of wrongfully, but she's expected to stay silent and docile, and she wants to keep the peace in her family, and she doesn't want to make her father upset, and she's just trying to do the right thing, but inside she's boiling. Very relatable. And also, her friendship with Roger Hamley is great. That said, I didn't love the book as much as I expected to, and I'm not sure why. It might be that even though, as I said, I haven't seen the 1999 adaptation in a while, I still remembered it pretty well, and since it's a very faithful adaptation, there weren't a lot of surprises for me here. I knew what was coming, and therefore was able to dread certain things that I knew were coming. In a similar vein, characters and plot twists that I find irritating in the miniseries, which keep me from wanting to revisit it regularly as I do North and South, feel so much more prolonged in a 644-page book. Or it could also be, and this is a trivial thing, but the provincial setting and side characters reminded me so strongly of the Cranford miniseries, Cranford also being by Elizabeth Gaskell, that it became confusing. For example, I kept mistakenly picturing the Miss Brownings as Judi Dench and Eileen Atkins, who played very similar roles in Cranford. In the Wives and Daughters miniseries, those parts were played by Deborah Findlay and Barbara Flynn, who were also in Cranford. Oh, and Francesca Annis was also in both miniseries, so no wonder I got mixed up. Perhaps my overall feeling toward the book would have been different if I hadn't already been familiar with these miniseries going into it, and therefore had my brain firing all these comparisons. There's no way of knowing. This is kind of an argument in favor of reading the book before you ever see an adaptation, but I saw that adaptation when I was probably, I don't know, 11? I don't want to say that one is better than the other, but I would say that if you don't have the time to commit to reading a lengthy novel, a lengthy Victorian novel, which in some ways is lengthier than your average lengthy novel of today, then you could just watch the miniseries. It's 5 hours long, which is long, but it gets it done. It's very faithful. It's very well cast. I really like how they solved the problem of Gaskell's unfinished ending. She died before she completed the book. And plus, it stars Justine Waddell, and she is one of my favorite period drama actresses. I always particularly enjoy her. So, the choice is up to you. Since I ended up with a couple days of October left over after finishing Wives and Daughters, I also read The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, which was a very silly play, as I expected it would be. It's about two guys who use fake identities as a means of leading a double life. Jack has invented a brother named Earnest and assumes that identity when he's in town, and Algernon has invented a sickly friend named Bunbury, who he uses as an escape to get out of any engagements he doesn't want to keep. Problems arise first when Jack wants to marry a woman who specifically likes that his name is Earnest, and secondly when Algernon adopts the Earnest identity for himself in order to visit Jack's ward in the country. Unfortunately, he ends up doing it right at the same time that Jack arrives in the country with news that Earnest is dead, and everybody else ends up arriving at the same time, and there's massive confusion. The play is hilariously subtitled A Trivial Comedy for Serious People, which is pretty accurate. Wilde's writing has a relentless comedic cadence. Bam, bam, bam. One witticism after another with barely a pause between laughs. It's the kind of wit that you have to think fast to keep up with, but it's not so lofty that it's out of reach. I've seen the 2002 film with Rupert Everett and Colin Firth a few times, and I can report that it's very close to the original, except for certain visual interpretations. I'm not sure, but I think this is the first Oscar Wilde play that I've read. Not my first Wilde, though. I have read The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is completely different. So that was October, and now I'm currently reading a book called The Navy Gave Me Shoes by Douglas A. Bryant. Bryant served in the U.S. Navy on submarines through World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Cold War until his retirement in 1967. We heard him give an interview on the radio a few months ago promoting his book, which is a memoir first of growing up during the Depression and then of his wartime experiences. His conversational style was interesting and he had some good stories to tell, so we got the book for my dad's birthday. Of course, I let him read it first. I always perk up my ears when someone starts sharing their old World War II stories. My grandfather was also a World War II veteran. Like Bryant, he served in the Navy, served in the Pacific, but he worked on PBYs, not on subs. I hardly ever heard him refer to the war when I was growing up, but there was one time when we were visiting him at a nursing home. I don't remember how it came about, But we were sitting there in a big room, and we were joined by some other old war vets, and all of them, including my grandfather, started swapping war stories and reminiscing together. They hadn't served together, they'd never known each other before they were in the nursing home, I don't think, but they had all these common experiences to share, even though they'd been posted in all different places. It was amazing. I just sat quietly and tried to soak it all in. Reading this book in a way reminds me of that day. The narrative follows a natural chronological progression, but it's not overly structured and it's only lightly edited, so it's like sitting there listening to Doug Bryant talk, only you're reading a transcription instead. He's just a regular guy. He wasn't a high-ranking officer, nobody famous. He doesn't act like he participated in any crazy adventures or any daring, heroic endeavors, but he has his own story to tell, like so many war veterans, and it's a pleasure to do him the honor of reading it. So those are the books that I've been reading recently. It's nice to be able to finally take some titles off the to-read list, although I'm sure that I added just as many as I was able to take off. That's typical. I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know your thoughts on any of the books that I mentioned in the comments down below, and I'll see you again very soon. Thanks for watching!